Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? I can. Yeah, it's loud. It's good. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a rare privilege to be speaking to this type of audience in this type of environment. It's always a pleasure also to be speaking to people who are at the, so to speak, the cold face. The practitioners who are working day to day with the athletes. I live in a world these days largely dominated by working with other scientists, so it's a real pleasure to be in this environment. You'll see from the title today, so I should firstly apologize that I'm presenting in English. I know it's a very rude thing to do, but it's being English, I only speak one language, and that language is English, so please bear with me. I'll try and speak as clearly as I can. The title of my presentation today is Evidence in Reality, the Athlete's Brain Placebo Effects and the Emerging Neurobiology of the Coach-Athlete Relationship. It's a very grand title. It promises much. I sincerely hope that it delivers. I was discussing the presentation with the organizers a few minutes ago. I'm not here today to give you very simple answers or very simple solutions to this particular problem, but I sincerely hope that some of the data that I present and some of the ideas that I discuss will be helpful to you in better understanding the processes that allow your athletes to perform at their absolute best. So let's briefly start with some sort of introductory material. I've put there a model of what could be described knowledge or evidence, however you want to call it. You can see in that model there is a fairly substantial area that is, so I'm looking the wrong way, fairly substantial area that is truth and another area that is belief. There's a clear dichotomy in that model between the idea of truth and belief. The definition that has been provided with that model is evidence or knowledge is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or a proposition is true or valid. Now, if we look at that model, we could take an example such as confidence. We might argue that it's a true statement to say that confidence is good for performance. However, when we look at that small yellow dot in the middle, our knowledge of the relationship between confidence and performance is far smaller than the total game, shall we say. The reality is there are a lot of beliefs about confidence and performance. There are a lot of false beliefs or falsely based beliefs that may be true. There are a lot of unknowns about confidence. So basically, when we're talking about evidence, when we're talking about knowledge, we may be talking in real terms about a very small area of the entirety of practice in sports coaching. Let's look at something that's perhaps a little bit more familiar, the idea of evidence-based practice, EBP. Now, in that model there, we've got three components. I'm sure you're familiar with those. On the left, we have the best research evidence, this idea that there is a set of data, a set of a collection of information, a database that tells us something real about the world in which we work with our athletes. At the top, we have coach expertise. That's what you guys bring to the party. And on the right, we have something slightly more complex. That's athletes' beliefs. That's the context in which the athlete finds himself. Now, and there's a definition there of evidence-based practice as the integration of coach expertise, athlete beliefs and values, and the best research evidence into decision-making, into the activity with which you engage your athletes on a daily basis. Now, if we look at that evidence model, that knowledge model in slightly more detail, I think it's quite important to look at this and think we would like, ideally, to be working in that section, in the area I've just outlined in red, the area that is fundamentally truths, some poorly justified yet true beliefs, and knowledge. Most of us aspire to work in that zone. The reality is that most of us work in this zone. Most of us work in a zone where there is a relatively small area of confirmed knowledge, of hard evidence, where there are some poorly justified beliefs which may or may not be true, and when there is a very, very large area of pure belief, unsubstantiated belief. Now, in the middle, as I said, we've got knowledge. That's the firm stuff. That's the stuff you find in the peer-reviewed journals. That's the things you know to be true. But that constitutes a very small part of the total. So in working with athletes, we often find ourselves working an awful lot with beliefs. Your beliefs as coaches. And your beliefs as coaches are very, very important components of the coach-athlete relationship and in the success of that relationship. But also what we have in this model is this kind of weird dichotomy, this idea that beliefs and truths are somehow opposite. They are separate things. And what I'm going to do today is talk about the research that we've conducted and which some of our colleagues have conducted that questions that assumption. But I'd also like to go back to the evidence-based practice model, because this model does the same thing. On the bottom left, you've got best research evidence. On the bottom right, you've got athletes' beliefs and values. Again, a dichotomy. There's a stark contrast. The arrows are pointing at each other as if in opposition. And what I want to do today is to present research evidence for the critical role of athletes' belief in sports performance. And it's going to be about essentially joining that line, identifying that the evidence for the role of beliefs means that essentially this could be a two-unit model with coach expertise and best research evidence, because the best research evidence is now pointing towards the role of belief as being significant and perhaps more important, controllable in sports performance and in sports coaching. So what I'd like to do today is talk about a model for the study of belief and a model for the study of the human brain, a model for the study of the emergent neurobiology of the human brain. And that model is the placebo effect. It's a fascinating thing. It kind of doesn't exist, but it's very powerful. It's a paradox. You can give an athlete a capsule that has nothing in it, and it can have powerful effects, as long as you don't tell them the truth about what's in that capsule. So there are some ethical challenges as well around this research. But before I start recounting some of our research from our lab and some work that's been conducted in other labs in Europe, I'll just give you a very brief definition. The placebo effect is a positive outcome resulting from the belief that a beneficial treatment has been received. There's a counter effect, what one of my PhD students last year described as the naughty little brother of the placebo effect. This is the nocebo effect. And I think the nocebo effect is more fascinating. The nocebo effect is a negative outcome resulting from the belief that a treatment that has been received is harmful. And as we'll see as we go through these data, the nocebo effect is quite complex because it doesn't necessarily rely upon a harmful treatment. It can be the result of simply thinking that a treatment is worthless. And you'll see from some of our laboratory studies and some of our field studies that athletes have actually responded quite negatively because they didn't believe the treatment had value, as opposed to it necessarily being harmful per se. So the placebo effect is a fairly emotive thing to work with. It brings out strong emotions in people, strong positive emotions sometimes, strong negative emotions sometimes. I've spoken at conferences where people have come up to me afterwards and said, "This is fantastic. It's so good that you're talking about the placebo effect. The world needs to know about this," as if it's some form of quasi-spiritual process. I go to other conferences and people leave the room because they look at this idea, this counter-scientific, this counterintuitive idea and say, sorry, this is not what I call real science. The truth is somewhere between the two. We study the effect because I don't believe that anything could be so well ingrained in the human psyche without having some grain of truth. And when we started studying it, we found some quite exciting effects. But it is an emotional thing. We recently published this paper. The paper is called Caution. This treatment is a placebo. It may work, it may not. And it created quite a mixed response. Some people applauding us for writing it, other people saying, surely your title suggests the placebo is worthless. If the placebo effect is worthless, why are you bothering to study it? So in talking about this effect, I want you to be very clear that I'm not here today to say that the placebo effect is something you can use in your day-to-day practice. I'm not here to say that the placebo effect is all-powerful. It is the power to heal yourself or the power to magically enhance performance. What I am here to say is that our study of the placebo effect has uncovered physiological and increasingly neurobiological mechanisms that are of interest to all those who seek to draw the best performance out of athletes in sport. And this is critical. Every single study we've conducted has revolved around one very, very important process. And that process is a conversation. Because as you'll see in our studies, we tell athletes something. What we're telling them may not always be true, but we're doing this in the lab. This is part of how we do what we do. We tell them something, and we have a conversation. And that conversation has an element of trust built into it. It has an element of practitioner and client built into it. It has an element of expert and novice built into it. It's not unlike the type of conversations you have with your athletes on a on a daily basis, I'm sure. So when we talk about these data, think about the idea that these effects that we've seen are the result not of very complex experimental designs, not of very complex manipulations. They are the result of conversations. We sit down with an athlete, we talk to them, and then we see how the athlete responds to that conversation. As you'll see, the placebo effect is not the result of the placebo. The placebo effect is the result of the conversation. We're not injecting a drug, we're not injecting a placebo, we're injecting an expectation. We're injecting words, something you do on an almost daily basis, as I say. The two photos there are from the BBC program that we mentioned earlier, that was mentioned a little while back. An amazing day. The BBC film crew were very keen to film one of our studies. And they were really good scientists. They knew their stuff inside out. They knew everything about our research. But they wanted one thing and one thing only. They wanted an athlete to produce a personal best whilst taking a placebo. And in the very last trial, the very last day, the gentleman in the photo produced a personal best in the kilo time trial, track cycling. He did a phenomenal ride. And when we told him afterwards that he hadn't actually taken anything, he was absolutely blown away and had the courtesy to do that, to be quite amazed and to be very articulate about how it had felt in front of the TV cameras. And I'll come on to the types of studies in a second. But as I say, that effect was largely a result of those conversations on a regular basis with our athletes. So I'm going to talk about 3 studies that we've conducted in our lab, which I think are important. Then I'm going to talk about some studies that some colleagues have conducted in theirs. I'm going to get through them quite quickly because I think the implications are the important bit. But it's worth really thinking about the implications of these studies for working with athletes. In the first study that we conducted, which, by the way, was a really, really badly designed study. We really got the design wrong originally, and we realized quite early that we probably should have designed it differently, but we'd already started collecting data, so we went with it. And as it turned out, we got really, really lucky, and a badly designed study came up with some really, really exceptional data. But what we did, we asked cyclists to, in a repeated measures design, cyclists performed baseline trials over 10 kilometers, and then they were given either a placebo, low dose of caffeine, or a high dose of caffeine, randomly assigned. So in no particular order. We told them it would be randomly assigned. They didn't know what to expect. At least that's what we told them. Of course, what we actually gave them was a placebo in each condition. So cyclists were expecting to get nothing, low-dose caffeine, high-dose caffeine, and got placebo all the way through. The results were pretty startling. We didn't expect to see anything as clear as this. And I'll tell you why we saw these results in a second. In The trial where the athletes thought they'd been given a placebo, they performed below baseline. I'll come back to that. They underperformed by 1.5%. 1.5% lower than they performed at baseline when they thought they'd been given a placebo. 1.5% above baseline when they thought they'd had low-dose caffeine, and 3% above baseline with high-dose caffeine. But it was all placebo. 3%, you'd take 3%, wouldn't you? Those of you who coach endurance athletes or any athlete who competes against the clock, 3%, you have to work very, very hard for that. We got it by giving athletes corn flour. It's stuff you put in food. We couldn't afford clinical grade placebo. It's too expensive. So what we saw was a very, very lovely dose-response effect. Beautiful straight line. I mean, I know that it's not quite as, that's a slightly cheated line. But the point is, we saw a dose-response effect, and that really surprised us, And then we started to realize why we'd seen this dose-response effect. I'll come back to this point in a minute. This point is really important. Why do athletes underperform? I'll come back to that. Why did we see a dose-response effect? Well, this is what happened. Sorry, where are we going? Are we going forwards? We seem to be stuck on. There we go. That's better. Sorry. So we informed them of the protocol. What we didn't realize is that the athletes were calculating things. The athletes were setting up their own expectations on the basis of their minute-to-minute experience during the trials. So they would receive treatments randomly assigned. After the first trial, we said to them, what do you think you were given today? And they calculated. They said, today didn't feel any different to the baseline. And if it didn't feel any different to the baseline, that means it was probably the placebo condition. We interview all of our athletes, by the way, one-to-one after each trial. So we sat there, myself and one of my research assistants, kind of nodding politely, partly because it felt like the right thing to do. So we sat there nodding, and they left thinking they'd all been given placebo that day. Guess what happened with the second trial? We asked the same question, what do you think you got today? Now, they've all calculated, by that point, they've calculated that I've already had the placebo. I'm getting one placebo, one low-dose caffeine, one high-dose caffeine. Today didn't feel that good, though. Kind of felt better than the placebo. Didn't feel that good, so that must have been the low-dose caffeine. So they're negotiating their way through this trial. By the way, they didn't get any feedback performance-wise during the trials, so they were totally blind to performance. So they weren't calculating it on the basis of their times. They were completely blinded. So, of course, prior to the third trial, they've all worked out, I've had the placebo, I've had the low-dose caffeine, today I must be getting the high-dose caffeine. And look what happened when they believed they must be getting the high-dose caffeine. 3% over baseline, 3%. So we were encouraged by this, hugely encouraged by this. And there was a very key thing that emerged. We were thinking at first that the dose-response relationship was for placebo, which doesn't make any sense. I'll tell you why it doesn't make any sense. Because it was the same dose of placebo in each capsule. You can't have a dose-response relationship, a nice straight-line relationship, if there's no change in dose. The dose-response relationship was for expectation. The dose-response relationship was with the expectation they'd set up for themselves. It was a dose-response relationship, essentially, around their own beliefs about what was going on. You know what was really interesting as well is that you'll ask an athlete, how did it feel when you had the high dose of caffeine? And they'll tell you, oh, man, I was on top of it. It felt so easy, no chain on the bike. I was pumping it out, absolutely pumping it out. No one, if I'd been racing today, no one would have got near me. And then you say to them, after you've got these narrative descriptions from them, we didn't give you any caffeine. There was no caffeine in there. And they tend to smile. I've only had one person try to hit me, and that was very briefly. It's why you need to have a very big research assistant when you do this type of work. But and then you get into a very interesting discussion around how and why that's happened. It's a fantastic psychological intervention because you discuss a number of things, and the athletes tell us what they want to discuss. They say things like, Well, the implication is that there's something holding me back. If you didn't give me something, something in me is actually holding me back. Now, the athletes are saying this to us, not us to the athletes. So we then decided to have a little bit of a play around with a few other ideas around this. So we set up another study where we used team sport athletes doing repeat sprints. And we told one group of athletes, we're going to give you a drug, and this drug enhances your repeat sprint performance, but reduces your endurance performance. And we told the other group exactly the opposite. Excuse me. We said, this will enhance your endurance performance, but reduce your repeat sprint performance. Now, they didn't do an endurance trial, because we just started with the repeat sprint trial, and that's all we were ever going to do. But what we saw, again, was absolutely fantastic, in that, again, the athletes did exactly the same thing. They set up their own sets of expectation, and we saw what was a very clear nocebo effect. Look at that line. It's beautiful. The first three dots are, these three dots are the first three trials. These three dots are the second three trials. Look at that, dead straight line. They got slower and slower and slower. The intervention happened here. So 3 trials before, 3 trials after. But contrast that with what happened in the experimentals, in the positive belief group. They got slower at the same, in fact, they got slower at a slightly faster rate than the negative belief group. But look what happened after they took the placebo, which they believed was this performance-enhancing substance. Immediately getting fast again, back up to their original baseline speed. And again, we spoke to the athletes afterwards, and what did they say? Yeah, I felt great. I could feel that stuff. You know, and we work with athletes, we know the way they talk. So the athletes were... Now, I have to admit this. There was a little part of me kind of thinking, wow, are athletes more stupid than we think they are? Could I set up a really good business here? I could just go and buy a big thing of corn flour from the supermarket, fill up lots of capsules, and get a good business going. But the reality is, we know that they're not, because we were researching the placebo effect, because we know it's very powerful in medicine. And there's some very good data in medicine attesting to it. It's why we control for this. It's why we use placebo controls in medicine. And I've also placeboed myself on a few occasions, and if I have time, I'll tell you about those later. So we then decided to do a very, very, very good, well-controlled study. This took 2 years to conduct. It was very hard to do. And it was very hard to do because the experimental design was very complex. The experimental design required us in a repeated measures design, so every athlete does every condition. In one condition, the athletes are told, we're giving you nothing, and they're given nothing. In another condition, they're told, we're giving you caffeine, but we give them nothing. It's the same as a placebo condition. We're telling them we're giving them caffeine, but we're giving them nothing. But now it gets quite complicated. In the third condition, we tell them they're getting nothing, but they get caffeine. So I may have said the previous one incorrectly. The previous one, we tell them they're getting caffeine, but in the third condition, we tell them they're getting nothing, but they get caffeine. Very hard to do experimentally. So they believe they're getting nothing. It took us a year to pilot the method that would allow us to give athletes caffeine without them knowing they'd got it. It was all done very ethically. It was all done very safely. And in the fourth condition, we tell them they're getting caffeine, and they get caffeine. It's called the balanced placebo design. It's been used in alcohol, and interestingly enough, we tend to find that with alcohol, if people believe they've taken alcohol and haven't, they get just as drunk as people who have taken alcohol but believe they haven't. So it's an interesting design. But this is what we saw. Look at those percentages. When people believe they'd take it, I'll put the graph up as well. Let's actually firstly start at the left-hand side. Look at the effect when people believe they've had caffeine and have. It's significantly enhanced over performance, 6%. And these were good cyclists, 6% over baseline. But the middle two columns, the middle two bars are really interesting. When they believed they'd had caffeine but hadn't, and believed they hadn't had caffeine but had, It's about the same level of performance. It's kind of starting to suggest that caffeine only provides half the effect of caffeine, that the other half of the effect of caffeine is provided by what? It's provided by the brain of the athlete. It's provided by the neurobiological processes of the athlete's brain. And once again, we saw this performance below baseline. When the participants, when the athletes didn't believe they'd taken caffeine, they underperformed. This was increasingly starting to tell us something very important, that actually it might not be the placebo effect that's the really interesting thing. It might be the nocebo effect that's the really interesting thing. The nocebo effect essentially being that negative response. And what we started to think was, perhaps the placebo effect isn't actually anything more than the process that switches off the nocebo effect. It's like they're two sides of the same coin. We've still got a lot of work to do on this, but as you'll see from the next few slides, it's become quite an important part of our work. The most frequently asked question, in fact, let's have a look at this first, because this is quite important. There's a graph here of athletes who responded to placebos in studies and athletes who didn't. And the most telling thing here is, again, in the left-hand column. It's in this column here, because these athletes here are responders. The dark columns are responders. The light columns are non-responders. The athletes who responded to the placebo also responded better to caffeine. They responded better to all forms of treatment, to both forms of treatment, which again supported this idea that the placebo effect, the neurobiological brain effects, somehow are additive with the actual treatment effect, in this case of caffeine. So that was a very, very important finding. Placebo responders responded better to real caffeine than did placebo non-responders. I'm going to come back to a study at the end of this, which really links back to that. But this is really, really important, because this is this additive effect. Placebo effects don't happen on their own. They happen alongside real things, real treatments. That treatment might be caffeine, that treatment might be coaching. But you get this placebo effect on top of those two. So this is the question I'm asked more than any other, because coaches, sports scientists, all immediately leap to one conclusion. If I've got a team of placebo-responsive athletes, they're all going to go faster. It's not that simple, but that's the sort of logic that, to an extent, underpins this. So they then say, how can I get my athletes to be placebo-responsive? Now, as I say, this is not a particularly serious question, but it leads to some very serious research and to some very interesting research. Most of it conducted by a gentleman called Fabrizio Benedetti, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Turin. Now, I'm going to talk about two of his studies, both in human performance, both related very strongly to sport, which really give us some clues about not just the fact that people can respond, but about the fact that people can learn to respond, can learn to acquire greater capacity to performance. So Benedetti and co-workers in 2007 used a hand grip task. Not particularly sports-specific, but still it's a muscular endurance task. And they did it in quite a cunning design. They set up a training program. So in week 1, they had to maintain grip on this dynamometer for a certain period of time. I believe they did it for about 15 minutes before they could not maintain force any longer. In week 2, they did the same. Participants produced about the same level of force. In week 3, they did the same. Now in week 4, this is in the control group. In week 4, they had a competition, and they produced slightly more force in the competition, and in week 5, they were back to baseline again. That's what we'd expect to see. A slight edge in competition, a slight increase in performance. But in the experimental group, they did something really quite interesting. Same thing at week 1. Week 2, they gave them morphine. They injected them with a powerful analgesic drug, a drug that allowed them to maintain force that little bit longer. Week 3, they gave them morphine again. Week 4, the competition week, they didn't give them morphine. They gave them an injection of saline that appeared to be morphine, but wasn't. And what they saw was a significantly raised level of performance over baseline. They conditioned this response. Now that, to me, was a really, really, really interesting finding. But then they did something even more interesting. They gave half that group a substance called naloxone, which antagonizes the effects of morphine in the brain. And what did they see? Performance dropped back down to baseline. You might say, well, that's what you'd expect. It's antagonizing, it's blocking the morphine. But there was no morphine administered. It was a placebo injection on that day. So what did this tell us? It told us that these effects are not just happening in the brain, but they are using pathways that the effect that they are mimicking are also using. The placebo effect, the acquired placebo effect, was mimicking the drug pathway. It's a problematic study because it used a drug. And I always feel slightly hesitant to discuss it in this sort of context. So I'm going to give another example, which I think is far more applicable. It's not quite as powerful, but it's more applicable in the coaching context. It relates really to false positive feedback, but applied in a slightly different context. So again, Paulo, one of Benedetti's co-workers, used a leg extension task, and they used 2 approaches, one of which was leading the athletes to expect an effect, and the other one was helping the athletes learn an effect. So I'll take you through what they actually did. So they basically repeated one of our designs, told athletes you're getting caffeine today, and they observed an improvement in leg extension performance, an improvement in the number of repetitions before fatigue. But they did something far more cunning in the conditioning phase. In fact, I'll go through it here. What they actually did was at week 1, they produced an amount of work against a fixed resistance. And you can see that there. Actually, the vertical axis isn't quite correct in this, but you can forgive me that. In week 2, they dropped the weight. And at the same time, they gave the athletes caffeine capsules. Were they caffeine capsules, do you think, or might they have been placebo capsules? They were placebo capsules. So the athletes paired the placebo with what they believe was higher levels of performance. They gave them a placebo capsule. The athletes attributed the high level of performance to the capsule. Week 3, they did the same. They saw a slightly higher level of performance. Week 4, they returned the weight stack to its previous weight, to the weight it had been at baseline. And what they saw, again with the placebo capsule, was that edge, that extra bit of performance. It's probably 3, 4, 5% extra performance. Now, what they had demonstrated, there were 2 mechanisms underlying this. There's the expectation of the athlete, the explicit expectation, something you can do verbally with them. You talk to them, we are going to do this is in this treatment, etc., like we did with our studies. And what Paulo also showed was that there's something else. There's learning, there's implicit learning. If you associate this stimulus with this response, it's classical conditioning, you will get that response. You will associate the 2. But it had never occurred to me that type of conditioning could be used to enhance the performance of athletes. Again, it speaks volumes about the neurobiology of the athlete's brain. So what we saw there was 2 studies, or 2 phases of the same study, where expectancy and conditioning had both been used to enhance performance with nothing other than those 2 processes, the expectation of the athlete and the learning of the athlete. So what did these studies tell us? Now, I've left out a very important piece of information, which was, I'd like to say I planned to do that, but I didn't. It's just poor planning on my part. In our first study, the thing that really mystified us most was that we saw an extra 3% amongst the cyclists in the high dose of caffeine group, but we saw no change in physiology, nothing. The physiology, heart rate, blood lactate, maximum oxygen uptake, VO2, all of the measures remain the same. And we've seen this across many of our studies, that the placebo response is not simply the result of the athlete trying harder. It's not the athlete pushing harder. It's more than that. In some studies, we've seen athletes pushing harder, certainly. Secondly, they can occur in the absence of increased physiological stress, as I just said. But this is the critical thing. They can be negative. Negative expectations set up negative performance in the same way that positive expectations set up positive performance. Placebo effects are the result of expectation, and they are the result of conditioning. Both these mechanisms are manifest in the neurobiology of athletes. And this is what so much of the work now, the technology to look at the living brain is getting better year on year on year. And we now can tie very specific effects, very specific outcomes to very specific activity in the brain. And this has shifted the emphasis in my area of work from what were generally effects that I've observed on performance, albeit reliably, using good measures, that were supported by self-report data, psychological self-report data, to the opportunity now to actually look at athletes' brains in real time whilst they're actually experiencing these types of effects. These mechanisms can be blocked by standard blockade processes. In neuroscience, it's a classic way of looking at how a process works, is to use something that antagonizes the biochemical agents in that process to see whether we can identify the particular process, naloxone in the case of the study I described earlier. And they can be learned. Now, this is really important because I'm not talking about explicit learning. I'm not talking about the sort of learning that you do in a lab. I'm talking about the sort of learning that athletes acquire day in, day out on the training field, in the gym, in competition with their teammates. That positive or negative belief systems emerge, are acquired by athletes in those contexts. This is I'll be rounding up in about 5 minutes. Is that okay? This is a study that's coming out this week in MedScience, Sport and Exercise. And it's a study, again, that we planned badly and found something that we didn't expect to find. And this goes back to one of a comment I made earlier. In this study, we tested 700 athletes from a number of sports. What we wanted to do was to see whether we could identify the factors that predicted placebo responsiveness. And we thought it would come down to status, personality, certain contextual factors, and only one thing predicted placebo responsiveness. And it's a really confusing thing, but it makes sense. We were using a fake sports supplement. And the only athletes, the majority of athletes who responded to that fake sports supplement were the athletes using sports supplements themselves. Now, initially, we were looking at this thinking, this is really odd. This doesn't make any sense at all. Of course, it makes huge sense. It makes huge sense on the basis of either expectancy or of conditioning. And if we go back to that earlier graph, which showed that the non-responders got a very low response to caffeine, the high placebo responders got a very high response to caffeine. It might be that placebo responsiveness is actually a factor in how well we respond to a number of different interventions in sport. I don't like calling it placebo responsiveness. I sincerely hope that it's going to be called sort of, neurobiological plasticity or something quite soon that will take it away from this kind of pejorative word placebo. But what we're certainly starting to see is that there are clear patterns in the behaviors of athletes. And it's really quite interesting that the study that's on the screen now hints at the idea that we could almost identify, if we went back to that now, we could identify 80 to 90% of the athletes who take supplements on the basis of their placebo responsiveness data, and likewise identify the placebo responsiveness from the supplement data. Of course, cause and effect is a bit difficult to define there, as I've just kind of clearly stated. But there's a few very important things to take away from this. Why is this the case? Firstly, because athletes who use supplements expect them to be effective. They don't expect them to not be effective. They don't expect them to have a negative effect. And they have a choice, usually, about using supplements. Athletes who use supplements are often conditioned to the effects of those supplements. But when we start talking about nocebo effects, negative effects, we start thinking about things that athletes don't have a choice about that could have a negative effect on their performance. I worked with an athlete recently, world-class cyclist, and he had a daytime ritual, a competition day ritual, which involved eating huge amounts of sweets that were very bad for him. But he's been doing it for years. And he was told by his nutritionist that he wasn't allowed to do it anymore, that he had to sort of toe the party line on race day food. And the interesting thing is, we had a discussion. He'd read some of our work, and he said, I think this is going to have a negative effect on my performance, not physiologically, but through the sort of nocebo-type mechanisms you've been talking about. So we have to start thinking about all of the sort of processes that athletes don't have choices about, that could be having a negative effect via these mechanisms. As I said, cause and effect are hard to define, but there's no doubt that these processes lie in the neurobiology of the athlete's brain. And this is really where I kind of wanted to come in with this presentation, this idea that we are entering a new era in research generally, in neuroscience research specifically, and it will filter down into the sport and exercise sciences very soon. The neuroscience of performance is going to become a precise science over the next 15, 20 years. And that is where there is going to be an awful lot of activity in the sports sciences and in the coaching sciences. I've stolen the idea from the book there, which is by Fabrizio Benedetti, which talks about the new emerging neurobiology of the doctor-patient relationship. This is just the same. Your relationship with many of your athletes is not unlike the relationship between a doctor and their patient. So, key things to take away with you. Firstly, there are some key variables in sport which are undeniably affected by placebo processes. Pain. Pain is the most placebo-responsive phenomenon in all of the placebo effect literature. Highly placebo-responsive. So much of what an athlete does is limited by pain. But pain is an extraordinarily subjective and extraordinarily modifiable process. Secondly, fatigue. Most of the research points out perceptions of fatigue are extremely placebo-responsive. Thirdly, reward. And reward leads to motivation. Motivation is placebo-responsive. When I say they're placebo-responsive, I mean that all of them respond well to positive expectation and to positive learning experience. And if you can improve the pain tolerance, the fatigue resistance, and the motivation of your athletes, you try telling me you won't get better performance from your athletes through those processes. They're all susceptible to expectation and all susceptible to conditioning. I'm not going to talk about this study. This is the study we're currently conducting. I think it's relatively, it would take too long to do it. But I want to leave you with this idea. There's an active ingredient in coaching. There's a number of active ingredients in coaching, in fact. There's the coaching strategy, be it a micro strategy, a meso strategy, or a macro strategy. There's the athlete's belief in the strategy, and that's important. There's the coach's belief in the strategy, and there's the athlete's belief in the coach. You also then have organizational culture. But in three of those, beliefs are pivotal, and we've seen the effects of beliefs on the brain of the athlete in the studies I've shown you. I'm imagining that if we put some coaches in the same situation, we might find similar effects, albeit in different contexts. So if we go back to this, that model we came in with, let's look at this. We're not working there. We are working here. But what is increasingly evident is that that line doesn't suggest a dichotomy. That line suggests a strong relationship. Beliefs become truths in the athlete's mind. Something that the athlete believes, expects, anticipates can become truth because of that anticipation. It's no longer pseudo-psychology. It is now clear, hard neurobiology. If we look at this model of evidence-based practice, we see that the dichotomy at the bottom, best research evidence, pointing directly at athletes' beliefs and values as if they're antagonistic to each other, they now become essentially the same thing because the best evidence now suggests the role of beliefs and values in enhanced performance. So the placebo effect happens in the brain before it happens in the body. Clearly, we have to always keep that in mind. The placebo effect is always going to be manifest in the brain. It can be enhanced, reduced, or antagonized by coaching behaviors, and it can be enhanced, reduced, or antagonized by organizational cultures and processes around the athletes themselves. And I believe that was my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to welcome, if we have time, questions.
Sure. We go for 2 questions.
Okay.
Your applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
A small present from Magglingen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
2 Fragen. Die erste. The first one is written here, or at least in some seconds.
It's a small question, isn't it? Culture. I worked with a team in the UK recently, and a very highly ranking officer of the Olympic Association in Great Britain describes the coach. He said the coach is a human placebo. People just have to go into that squad and they start performing better through being in that squad because there's a culture of expectation, and the expectation is of this squad is high performance. Now, that's a very confused cycle. But ultimately, I've worked with quite a few teams on this idea of, I don't call it placebo culture, that sounds flawed, but certainly the idea that you enhance expectation through the culture of the team. Now, we all do that, I'm sure, but what we've got to be very careful to do is to not undo that work with negative beliefs or expectations or values creeping in. And I think it's this idea of almost inoculating the team and the culture of the team against the types of doubts and negative expectations that result in nocebo responses amongst athletes. Thank you.
Und noch eine Frage aus dem Publikum. Wo brennt's?
I wonder, are there any information what happened when you told afterwards the athletes you worked with placebo? Do they respond any further to supplement or a placebo in the future?
It's a very, very interesting question. We have a whole line of research now which focuses on the most consistent finding from all of our research, more consistent than placebo effects being observed, is that athletes who've experienced a placebo effect, probably 80 to 90% of them have said, I clearly do not need to use the substances I'm using anymore. Now, we now are working with UK anti-doping and several anti-doping agencies on trying to develop a protocol that enables us to ethically help an athlete experience a placebo response of something they believe is a legal drug. And then, as I said earlier, it becomes a very good opportunity for a psychological discussion around the psychology of performance because, as I said, athletes often say things such as, so my brain is actually holding me back. If I can produce 3% more as a result of taking a capsule of nothing, my brain is holding me back. What is causing that? Now, it's not as simple as that, because we know there are various reward mechanisms involved in the response to a placebo believing it's a drug, and that it's not a case of holding back, but it is a case of helping athletes understand that all of the performance enhancement effects we've seen in the studies are the result of their brain and nothing more than their brain. And to a degree, they have a lot of control over their brain. So we have an anti-doping angle. And funnily enough, the study that I said was quite poorly designed recently, or at least we found a different finding to that which we expected, was part of the large anti-doping study, which will be published quite soon. Something else we found that was very interesting is that a slightly worrying trend that when we started talking to athletes about the anti-doping applications of placebos themselves, we found that about 25% of athletes who weren't using substances wanted to go and try using substances. And when we interviewed some of them, they said, this is interesting, because if you're telling me that nothing can improve my performance by 3%, and you're then telling me in some of your research that that 3% is added to the biological effect of the drug itself, I want to start taking the drug, and I want to get the 3% plus the 3%. So it's difficult. And we got picked up in a newspaper recently in the UK about this idea that there's a slight tension in our data. So I would like to think it has a positive effect, but it's not going to be positive for all athletes. Thank you.
Super, danke schön. Noch einmal ein großer Applaus für Chris Beedie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And my daughters will love these.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, super. We can give you a second one.
Thank you.
Wenn ihr noch mehr Fragen habt an Chris Beedie, könnt ihr auf ESI noch eintippen und wir werden ihm die dann übersetzen und nach England schicken und dann habt ihr die Antwort in den nächsten Tagen. Also scheut euch nicht, hier noch einige Fragen